We found and followed the Atlanteans' trail, first in sand, then in soil, as the footprints led from the beach to the island's interior. Initially, I assumed their boat had run aground by accident on an equally foggy day as ours, but in reality, that was the only way for their vessel to come ashore. When the Atlanteans arrived, it had been on a clear day. We could tell by the tracks. They were not muddled and did not meander, but rather marched in one shore direction. They could see exactly where they were going, so our group used the path they had made. Sure enough, it brought us to the bridge connecting this island to the next. Before crossing the viaduct, however, Joseph paused to give some brief concern to what we had found abandoned there. He identified the thing as a sedan. No, it wasn't a four-door economy vehicle with power windows and air conditioning. It was a kind of vehicle, however. We looked upon a small enclosed chair with poles on either side for carrying. It had a roof, but only curtains for walls. Pulling one aside, I saw another of those feathered cushions that my husband had found among the wreckage of the boat. The Atlanteans had been transporting the cat as royalty. It's good to be the queen, I guess.
Why did they leave it behind?
Maybe it was too much weight for the bridge?
Then why is it overturned like they dropped it?
Attacked?
Something ahead.
Where?
On bridge. There.
The six of us moved slowly, cautiously forward. The viaduct wasn't massive, just wide enough for a group like ours to cross side by side, and this is how we did so, weapons in hand. Remy had spotted something briefly through a gap in the fog, but it had refilled before he could get a second look, and before the rest of us could get a single one. Whatever awaited, the thing was between us and the next island. So, unavoidable. We had to keep our eyes up, but this was harder than you'd think. Our attention was divided between two threats. There was the mysterious one that lurked somewhere in the fog ahead, but also the obvious one beneath our feet. The bridges, as mentioned, were very old now, and many had likely been damaged during the siege of these islands. We had to mind our footing as well as the way ahead. Mercifully, the bridge was sound enough to support the weight of our party. It was very strong indeed. Not only could it hold all of us, but a dragon as well. No, listener, you didn't mishear me. I said a dragon. That's what awaited us. And if we wanted to cross this bridge, we had to get around him first. This is the Endless Elsewhere podcast, Chapter 19, The Ghost Town. Not to immediately deflate the tension or anything, but it was dead. This came as a relief, certainly, but I was far from relieved. Even a dead dragon is still plenty horrifying, mostly because it was proof that they exist. From now until my dying day, I had to inhabit a reality in which there were actual dragons. Well, I keep saying dragon, but Joseph called it a wyvern, and when I asked what that was, he said it was a type of dragon. It wasn't quite the creature you might be imagining, though, listener, and that's because this thing only served to inspire the earthly myths of dragons. But if that was so, that meant this monster had been to my world. It had done more than visit, however. According to my husband, this thing was from there. He told me we were looking at a species that was, to us, extinct. This was a kind of pterosaur. Only because we were sure that it was dead did we approach the wyvern, pushing through the fog to get a clearer look. The enormous thing lay slumped on its belly. The leathery wings of the creature not only spanned the width of the bridge, but folded over and hung off either set of guardrails. I couldn't see much of the short legs projecting behind it, just that each foot had some serious talons. Besides, it was the long, pointed head of the pterosaur that held greater interest. An enormous beak stretched forward, while a colorful crest thrust backward. The eyes were hooded and lifeless. I couldn't accept that this thing had actually originated from my planet's prehistory. It was too ludicrous, yet here it lay. Apparently many creatures had come through the portal in ancient times. In this place they had propagated, escaping the extinction of their ancestors on Earth, but it was an annihilation that was to eventually catch up to them all. As we would learn on a later island, we were looking at the very last pterosaur. With its death, the species was now, truly and forever, extinct. On every world. Dinosaurs, Joseph?
Not to be that guy, but technically this would not be classified as a dinosaur. But according to the books, they do have those here somewhere.
Of all the things you didn't mention, this has to be the most unforgivable.
I told you to...
Read the books. I know. I'm really starting to regret having not. So, did this thing attack the Atlanteans or what?
Yes. But it was not they who felled this monster.
How do you know? May asked Joseph and Clyde to lift the head of the wyvern so that she could wedge her spear under its beak, propping it up. The neck and upper chest of the creature were visible now, as was the death blow. There was a sizable puncture, and around it, strangely colored scorching. The wound was purple, but not like bruising. No, it was unnaturally vibrant, almost radiant. The afterglow of whatever force had brought the monstrous thing down. It looked like a tongue of flame or a bolt of lightning or something had pierced the pterosaur somewhere between its throat and heart, rupturing one or both of these vitals. There was no doubt as to who had slain the dragon. The scenario, too, was obvious enough. The wyvern had attacked the Atlanteans who dropped the sedan, probably spilling the cat onto the ground. For the inconvenience alone, the witch had turned her dark arts against the pterosaur, eradicating its entire kind. I moved to my husband and pressed to his side. I could feel his tension and he mine. The pair of us had fought a variety of foes, to be sure, but never faced one who could wield power like this. We were dealing with actual sorcery now, and this was new to us. May kicked her spear free of the wyvern's beaked head, and it dropped back to the bridge resoundingly. Then, without a word, our leader took up her weapon and climbed over the creature. Joseph, Clyde, and I did the same as Flo and Remy opted to simply fly over the enormous carcass. When we'd reconvened on the other side, we started across what remained of the viaduct. There was no guessing the extent of it as the path stretched into the fog and vanished before us. As far as I knew, the following island could appear in a dozen steps or 100. Fortunately, it was closer to the former than the latter, and we soon reached the next link in the chain. There wasn't much to see here. The topography had been deforested and flattened, remade by the Atlanteans in a long-ago time to serve as an airfield for their fleets of dirigibles. I might have guessed, since the runway beneath us had been resurfaced with some kind of black asphalt. Or so I incorrectly assumed. Not until our group had to circumvent our first crater did I realize the truth. We were not walking across pavement. The entire island was char and soot, my husband explained. He said that before their campaign against the archipelago, even before the battle at Eyrie Castle, Gentry and the Ariels had launched a surprise attack against the Lost Isles. Pendergast had made up a series of incendiary bombs that they'd carried here, flying over and dropping their payloads on this airfield. They destroyed most of their enemies' airships, robbing the Atlanteans of this technological advantage. It was only the flagship and its 2 escorts earlier described by Joseph that had escaped this bombing. Having seen one of these dirigibles back in the plains, I recognized the bones of the others when they began to appear here and there in the surrounding fog. Aside from this wreckage and the occasional crater, there were no other obstacles and we quickly crossed the island. Nor were there any interruptions awaiting us on the next bridge. No dead dragons, so we spanned the water easily. The neighboring island was an industrial park with warehouses and factories, or so I was told. I would not have identified the buildings as such since they did not resemble our own versions of these whatsoever. All of the architecture that I witnessed on the archipelago was completely alien to me. The Strangels, with their castle and town, were far more human in their designs. Ironic, I know, since the fallen civilization before us was largely the product of human assembly. However, the architects of this place were decidedly inhuman. The Nephilim, the unholy giants, had designed their kingdom on a surreal scale, pushing physics and geometry beyond their known limits. And to hear it from May, I hadn't seen anything yet. We approached the nearest edifice and paused, surveying. The island was one elaborate complex, its many parts interconnected. This was true of all structures on the Lost Isles, I would learn. For as grand as they were, at this point of their abandonment and ruin, the buildings were just a bunch of walls that stood between us and the next bridge. I wondered if we could climb and fly up one side, then down the other, but that seemed risky. All of the buildings rose into the fog. I could not see to what extent any of them towered. I tried to remember their heights when seen from the sea, but I could not guess at them accurately. For all I knew, they could be skyscrapers. Before I could ask, May told us that it would not be safe to go over the structures, which left only through. That sounded just as risky to me, but in we went just as soon as we found an opening. This was not difficult. Enormous, rounded bay doors had been left open when the place was deserted. Dark as it was inside, I thought we'd need to devise torches, but the buildings had circular skylights which let in what little daylight there was. Even still, it was hard to see, and I misstepped more than once. I even slipped on something, nearly going down. Joseph caught me by the arm, though, saving me the embarrassment. In the same moment, Flo inadvertently kicked something small, sending it skidding off ahead of her. That's when May brought us to a stop and we all knelt to investigate. The floor was littered in a scattering of... I didn't know what they were. I picked one up and looked it over. It was an oval plate of convex metal. What is this?
An Atlantean vizard.
A what?
It's a mask.
But there are no eye holes. How could you see out?
Turn it over.
Doing so felt like a magic trick. One side of the mask was a hammered, pewter-like metal with a rough texture, but the reverse was like glass without blemish. I could see straight through every inch of the mask from the other side, so it seemed to vanish in my hands when I flipped it. This was some sort of advanced metallurgy, and it solved the problem of traditional masks that tend to hinder your sight in one way or another. To wear this mask was like wearing no mask at all. From the inside, nothing was hidden, but from the outside, everything was. The exterior of the mask perfectly disguised every feature of the wearer, even the eyes. Looking about me, spotting various molds, I realized that this whole factory had been dedicated to the manufacturing of these vizards. The place was essentially a highly advanced foundry. Because of previous experiences in this podcast, I could identify the Atlantean crucibles. I mean, this place even had skylights like the old Abshire iron foundry. Looking back to the mask, I noticed very small, almost imperceptible perforations around the mouth and nose. The mask was porous for air circulation. This would also keep the metal, glass, whatever from fogging up. I brought the mask close to my face. On some curious urge, I was about to try it on when I felt a firm hand on my wrist. May had reached out almost on reflex to stop me. I looked at her, surprised. The amalgam shook her head. I nodded in reply, returning the mask to the floor. I didn't know what the big deal was. Joseph did. The Atlanteans were denied their own identities. Every aspect of the individual was to be suppressed. No faces, not even names. They existed in a closely regulated caste system, recognized only by their tier of the hierarchy. Their Nephilim overlords had made them slaves. No, less than that. They were not even chattel. They were mere cogs in a machine. Now I understood better how the Atlanteans had fallen from the zenith of the technological to the nadir of the savage so quickly. They'd lost more than their civilization. They'd lost their purpose for existence. These poor souls had been brainwashed into mechanical servitude. Now, without functions to perform, without their giant puppet masters plucking their strings, they had gone increasingly feral, especially with their post-war banishing to that other continent. But that's where the Grimalkin had found them, and where she'd filled the power vacuum. The Atlanteans must have immediately accepted the witch as their mistress. They needed her more than she did them. Before I started feeling too sorry for them, my husband went on to tell me about the extreme eugenics practiced by the Atlanteans, of how they sought to purge all impurities from their race. I looked to Remy as Joseph spoke, wondering if the Ariel would make the connection between his poisoned ideology and that of the long-defeated enemy. Remy never lifted his eyes, however. We had lingered here long enough for it to be considered a break, from which May then got us moving again. We traversed what remained of the factory and soon emerged from the other side. We cut through 2 more interconnected buildings before emerging on the far shore. The next bridge and island awaited us. I assumed it was more buildings materializing through the fog ahead of us, but once we'd ventured deeper in, we saw that the structures were actually a series of massive wildlife enclosures. It looked like a futuristic zoo. As we neared the first enclosure, I went ahead of my companions, eager as I was to peer through its transparent wall. As I pressed my face to it, I realized that this barrier, that all of them, were probably constructed of the same metal as the masks. This meant that the animals could be studied in their habitats without them knowing it. Unable to observe their observers would have helped keep the creatures docile, whatever the creatures may be. My searching eyes soon found one. Well, what was left of it anyway. In a back corner, among the overgrown grass, lay a colossal skeleton. They were remains that I had seen before, years ago in a museum, as reconstructed fossils. But these were actual bones. As previously mentioned, the wyvern was one of several ancient species that had come to this other world before the extinction that claimed their kind on Earth. The Atlanteans and their Nephilim overlords, who were no different in that regard, had kept them as war animals. But after the war, when there was no more use for them, the animals had been abandoned, not unlike the Atlanteans who then did the same to the amalgams. Without caretakers, the creatures were simply left to die in their captivity. I withdrew from the enclosure and our group continued on. Other habitats were open and empty. May explained that some of the ancient Saurians had escaped or been turned loose, yet their situation remained unchanged, trapped as they were on this island. Without their attendants, they were doomed, their populations unsustainable. There was not enough natural vegetation for the herbivores, and not enough herbivores for the carnivores, so they too had eventually died off. It was the wyverns with their ability to fly that had survived longest on their own. They had gone to the sea for their food, diving into the water and scooping up all manner of fish. Despite the freedom to live anywhere they liked in this world, they had strangely remained upon this island. In fact, when our group came across one of their massive aviaries, we found that the pterosaurs had continued to nest inside of it. Their prison was still their home, even when it wasn't a prison anymore. The 6 of us finished our hike across the island, seeing not one living creature as we went. That's when we knew the slain wyvern had been the very last of the ancient earthly animals, and that they were all now truly gone. We crossed the next viaduct, but paused on the other side. It was darker now. I thought the fog was thicker on this island, but it was actually the sun going down. The day was ending, which meant we'd have to make camp on one of these islands, a possibility I had not considered beforehand. Clyde, also noticing the fading light, began signing to Remy. He had an idea, apparently. The Ariel's brow narrowed as if he didn't understand or didn't like what the aquatic was conveying.
What is it?
In no place. Place found by his kind.
A place we can stay?
Underground. Hidden.
Where is it?
Next island.
We go quick. Dark soon.
Very well.
We hurried to cross the island. As we jogged along, however, my husband fell further and further behind. He'd spotted something of interest off in the fog and reduced his pace to study it. I dropped back from the group to join him, to share in his curiosity. Looming on the far side of the island was a ruined observatory, or so he told me. He knew the place from the books and wished to look inside, but there just wasn't time. May called for the pair of us to catch up, and so we did. None in our group slowed again until we had crossed the next bridge. Then we came to a much-needed stop. Catching our breath, we all looked to the aquatic. May invited him to replace her as our guide. He did, leading his air-breathing friends to a grassy hill, what was in actuality some kind of earthwork. At the base of the steep mound, Clyde found a patch of sward and pulled it aside. Revealed beneath it was a hinged cover, and beneath that, a control panel. He pushed a button with his clawed finger, then stood and faced us again. We looked from the aquatic to the hill, to the door now folding open through the grass. I thought of the secret entrance to the Pendergast estate, but it was no cave that awaited us. This was a bunker. The aquatic moved to the open door, but there paused, noticing our hesitation to follow him. Clyde waved us forward. It was the same gesture he'd made for us to climb aboard the Leviathan. He was telling us it was safe. As if to prove it, he then disappeared inside. We trusted Clyde, certainly, but even still, there was an exchange of uneasy looks among the rest of us before we moved to the secret door. We found a stairwell just beyond it. This plunged surprisingly deep. Clyde was already at the bottom. From there, he again waved at his companions to keep on. Joseph shrugged and was the first to start down the steps. I followed closely behind him, the others behind me. Shadows alone awaited us at the bottom, so we reassembled blindly at the base of the stairwell. Clyde's enormous blackened eyes were designed for the depths of the ocean, so he could see just fine in this gloom. The aquatic seemed to have forgotten that his dry land companions did not share his night vision and just left us standing there for a time. We could hear his webbed footsteps as he went about the bunker. It wasn't like we could call out to the aquatic or even sign to him in the dark. The 5 of us had to wait for him to remember our need for light. I heard May mutter something harsh in her own language. By this, I guessed that the Strangels had no idea about this bunker. If they had, the winged people would have certainly destroyed it. The aquatics had apparently found this place on their own and kept its discovery a secret from their winged allies. Maybe because they knew the air breathers would destroy it. As we would learn, the Aquatics had been attempting to study Nephilim technology. They were not quite so zealous as the Ariels when it came to their enemy's knowledge, and thought there could be something of worth in it. This was honestly not so surprising a revelation. I thought of Clyde and his apparatus. His was a curious and highly inventive people. The only reason the Ariels and the Aquatics had ever met was because his kind had devised a way to explore the dry half of their shared world. As mentioned, the Ariels had spiritual gifts for healing and language and so on, but the Aquatics' gifts were for more practical fields, like engineering. They were innovators. I heard a second word of anger from May. This was not so quiet. I couldn't see her, but I assumed the amalgam's face was as red as her hair now. She was furious with Clyde and the Aquatics. She probably felt betrayed, so you can imagine the amount of persuasion it took to get her to spend the night in the bunker, and that only came after we talked her out of setting fire to the place. Because we had literally no other option did she finally relent to the idea of staying. I wondered then if her desire to see the Lost Isles erased from this planet had anything at all to do with the Strangel's aversion to Nephilim creations, or if it was, as I now suspected, a personal vendetta she had against this ruined kingdom, her former home. I would get my confirmation the next day. The exterior had reminded me of Pendergast's cave, but the inside reminded me of Joseph's vault, probably because it was of similar dimensions, or so I judged by the echo. I was growing impatient to actually see the place. Fortunately, Clyde, finally noticing that we had yet to step forward, realized his mistake and went about activating the lights. The interior erupted in a blazing, blinding mixture of yellow and blue. When my eyes had adjusted, I saw that the warmer glare was emitted from fixtures in the ceiling, while the colder glow came from the walls, where an array of computers had been situated. But don't imagine these with monitors. The sapphire illumination wasn't radiating from screens, but rather holographic projections, 3D displays that hovered in the air. It was a lot to be presented with all of a sudden. We struggled to take it in, doing so in a stunned silence. That is, until Clyde pushed yet another button and closed the outside door. At the top of the stairwell, it folded back into place, sealing with a noisy reverberation that startled the five of us. A short scream burst out of Flo, which gave her companions a second, somehow worse, fright. She cupped a hand over her mouth, embarrassed, when we all turned to glare at her. Our attention returned to the now fully illuminated bunker. I wondered what manner of power it called upon. If there was ever a grid on the archipelago, it would have been long destroyed. This place must have had its own independent source of energy. Maybe geothermal, or nuclear, or even alchemical. Whatever it was, I'd wager it was the same being used by the Argosy. You remember the Argosy. We discussed it last season. It's what the Cabal codenamed the spacecraft that blasted off from this very island chain decades ago, and which is currently hurtling toward Earth at faster than light speed, while all of its giant occupants sleep in suspended animation. But why, you wonder, am I bringing this up again? I only bother because there, in the center of the chamber, what Clyde had been using as a work table was one of the Nephilim's massive, casket-like preservation capsules. Not that I knew what it was, but Joseph thought he knew, and May sure as heck did.
We must destroy this at once.
Maevalesse, wait, please. Rhemigrayne, does he know what this is?
He no. Says empty.
Even still, we must...
Later, Maevalesse. We don't want to be making a ruckus right now, do we?
May alone stayed behind as the rest of us moved deeper into the bunker. Flo and Remy went to either wall to check out the holograms. They poked curiously at the immaterial imagery, then examined their hands for residue that wasn't there. It's worth mentioning here that these 3D projections were of technical schematics, accompanied by symbols, maybe words, that were completely alien to all of us. Joseph would give them his attention soon enough, but for now the stasis pod demanded his focus. It was enormous, maybe 12 feet in length and half that in width. Being the tallest of us, my husband alone could lean over and peer down into the porthole that was atop it, where the head of the occupant would be. He confirmed that it was, in fact, empty. Joseph did this for May, looking to her across the bunker. She nodded, reassured, but the amalgam didn't relax. At no point in the night would she be comfortable in this place. I looked from our leader back to the capsule. It was a lustrous white. It looked like polished marble, but when I set a hand on it, I didn't feel stone. It was something synthetic, a fabricated material similar to plastic, if plastic had the density of steel. I wondered how May had planned to destroy it. The thing looked bulletproof, let alone spear-proof. But she would have found a way, I have no doubt. probably the same method by which Gentry and the Ariels had made sure none remained by the end of their besiegement of the islands so long ago. Clyde, seeing our interest in the pod, signed to Remy. The aquatic was offering to open it for us, which he could apparently do. Joseph declined the offer, but then quickly set about barraging him with questions. He wanted to know how much they had learned about the giants. Remy signed quickly to keep up with my husband's inquiries. The answers that came were disappointing, however. We had more or less seen the extent of the aquatic's findings. Through trial and error, they had learned the mechanical functions of the bunker only. They could open and close the door, the capsule too, but even the lights were a recent discovery. Clyde and his kind had not deciphered the Nephilim language, not learned their innermost secrets. With a heavy sigh, Joseph stepped to the wall and the holograms that hovered there. It was all here, everything he wanted to know about the creatures. It was right in front of his face, literally. Yet it might as well have been bound in an impenetrable encryption. I glanced across the bunker to May, expecting to see her smile. Her lips didn't climb quite so high, but she wasn't frowning anymore. We were withheld from a peek behind the Nephilim curtain, and that gladdened the amalgam. She no doubt viewed the information as dangerous. Knowledge is the ultimate power, and it stood to reason that evil knowledge would make for an evil power. It could corrupt even the good, let alone the unsuspecting, luring them away from the universe's real authority, their mountaintop god. Maybe she was right. I thought of the Cabal who'd been seduced by this power. After all, they had cracked the encryption. Recall from our talk in Season 3, listener, that when they'd briefly possessed the orb and crossed over to this world, they had recovered one of the airships, gaining access to Nephilim technology. Also recall that the Beowulfs, those who had defected from the secret society, had used this knowledge to build their own preservation capsule, not unlike the one before us. The sarcophagus, they had called it, intending the thing for Grendel to trap his spirit in a body they could then preserve for eternity. That way, the man who had made himself a demon would not be freed upon the death of his host. In our second battle of Shady Hollow, we had accomplished at least half of that plan. Then it was Clyde's turn to question Joseph. The aquatic wanted to know what this was, what it was for. My husband, through our interpreter, explained that the giants had developed this technology to leapfrog through time, a phrase he then had to reword for this otherworldly man. Joseph told Clyde what he'd told me previously, what he'd learned from the books. Some of the giants would sleep while others were active, then they would trade off. But they were also testing these stasis pods over a long period of time to see if they would hold up, as the ultimate usage for the capsules would be aboard their twin spacecraft. The aquatic nodded inside of his water-filled helmet. He knew of these vessels, his people having seen them launch from the archipelago. He also knew that only one had actually left their world, the other having been brought down by Gentry and Pendergast. The spaceship now rested on the seafloor somewhere. As they continued to speak, my attention drifted to the capsule. As mentioned, Clyde had been using it as a table. A variety of small devices lay across it, things he'd found in the bunker and probably elsewhere on the islands. Whatever function any of them served was a mystery now, all of them long inoperable. But I thought one of them looked like a communication device, and I leaned over the pod to grab it. My reaching hand quickly returned to my person, however, gripping instead my field recorder, which I felt warming against my shoulder even through its pouch. I pulled the device from my harness and looked it over. The thing wasn't even on. How could it be overheating? But it wasn't overheating. It was charging rapidly. I glanced down and realized that when I'd leaned over the capsule, I bent low to a black oval plate of some kind. Even with space between them, it had begun charging my device. I then set the field recorder onto the plate. It was back to 100% in seconds. It was a contact charger. I had a comparable device for my cell phone back on Earth, but this one was vastly superior, so much so that it even charged batteries not from this world. I took the spares from my pocket and laid them on the plate. I hovered a hand over them, feeling the warmth. Just before they got hot, I plucked them off the charger and put them away again. I then lifted the black plate and looked it over. It powered devices, but had no obvious source of it. I did feel a slight vibration as I held the thing. Maybe it echoed energy, like when it sensed a power source, perhaps the device copied its signature of particles and fed them back into the battery. Or something. I have no idea. If we had Hardesty here, I'm sure he would have figured it out for us. However it worked, this device could be of profound use to us, and so, with everyone distracted by a fresh argument that had broken out, I discreetly slipped the contact charger into my satchel. And now, with fully charged batteries and a way to keep them so, I could use the field recorder more often.
We should not stay here. It is not safe.
It will be for just one night, Maevalesse. Just one night.
There is darkness in this place. We are not to seek shelter in the home of the enemy.
Enemy gone now. Safe.
And if we camp topside, we'll be exposed to...
Even still, we should. We repelled the attack in the plains. We will do so again upon this cursed island.
Maevalesse, here is better. Just one night.
It seems you are all in agreement on this matter. We leave at sunup.
All but May gathered around the makeshift table. It was a touch more civilized than sitting in the dirt around a fire, and it somehow made a proper meal of our rations. Despite our demure leader doing her best to cast a pall over the proceedings, the mood lightened and we spoke of more than just our mission. Dare I say, we even had some laughs. We'd had quite the day, and now with some food in our bellies, a shared sleepiness came over us all. We were quick to make up our beds on the hard floor of a bunker that had been designed to sleep only one. We opted to keep the lights on, just in case. May said there was darkness here, but the best we could do was keep the literal kind at bay. Clyde did not lie down, but rather sat himself in the corner, crossing his legs and arms, looking very meditative. In actuality, he simply could not recline in his apparatus and had to take his rest upright. He didn't seem uncomfortable, though. I was soon asleep, but like previous nights on this journey, I woke long before morning into the quietly muttered prayers of Flo. As the other strangels, she lay on her belly, wings steepled above her. She lifted and turned her head to me, hearing the change in my breathing that happens upon waking. The Ariel did her best to frame a smile, but there was no happiness in it.
You okay? I am not.
What's wrong?
I fail again.
Oh, that. Listen, it wasn't your fault.
Yes, it was fault. I coward, fled, sickness at castle, beast attack camp. I do nothing. Creature attack on beach. I do nothing.
Everyone freezes up, Flo. It happens.
Hate self. Why am like this?
Hey, don't talk like that. Come on, it all worked out, didn't it?
Must find way to prove self to others, to Maevalesse, to you.
You don't have anything to prove to anyone, especially me. You're out here with us, aren't you? You are no coward.
Coward and failure.
I don't believe that.
Will prove myself. You see.
And with that, Flo lowered and turned her head away as if she was going back to sleep, when really she was just ending our talk. I frowned, then rolled over as well, scooting closer to my sleeping husband. I would have sworn that I had only just fallen asleep when I awoke again hours later. It was dawn. Time to clear out. We had a quick bite to eat, then packed up and left the bunker. Clyde shut the place down behind us, then resealed the hidden door from the outside. May gave the grassy hill a contemptuous good riddance kind of glare, then led us away from it. The fog had not lifted. This time of year it was really bad in the coastal areas, just as it can be on Earth, so we were made to hike through the soup. At least we were used to it by now. Looking back on it, the fog was actually kind of helpful, in a sense. It kept me from seeing too much too soon. Previously, like when we first entered the dominion of the Strangels, I had been overwhelmed by the sights, as I would have been here on the archipelago, but the fog ensured that I would only witness one portion of this place at a time, giving me the chance to process each. This was beneficial as there was just so much here to see. But even with the fog buffering my sensory input, I was still overcome with awe upon seeing one of their cities up close. I had beheld the murky skylines of these from the ocean, but now we stood upon the far edge of the island, looking across the channel to the next, where monumental structures loomed imposing and forbidding. The next island was a metropolis. My heart sank when I saw that the bridge connecting the two islands had partially collapsed at the center. May, however, knew a way across, so we followed her farther down the shore. A lofty tower soon appeared through the fog, but neither it nor its sister structure on the opposite shore were of more interest to us than the lengthy skyway that connected the two. This enclosed, tube-like pathway spanned the water, allowing for elevated foot traffic between the two islands. I assumed that this additional thoroughfare had been constructed to relieve congestion. Having a city upon it, this island would have had a far heavier flow of pedestrians than its neighbors. There was some hesitation to enter the tower, but of course we did. It had windows aplenty, so the interior was navigable. If there had been elevators, they would be long out of service, so I expected to take the stairs, but there were none. There was, instead, an inclining ramp that corkscrewed all the way up the tower. It was a strain on the legs, but we made it to the top and to the skyway. Stepping onto the platform, we paused, letting our eyes venture across first. The rounded barrier sheathing the footbridge would protect us from the high winds that would have otherwise sent us toppling over the edge. This tube was also transparent, so as we started forward, our group was treated to a paramount view of the abandoned city as we entered it, or as much as the fog would allow us to behold.
I visited Manhattan once. That didn't really prepare me for this place, though.
I was just thinking of our own city.
You were?
It'll look like this one day.
Ruins, you mean? After the Cabal destroys it?
I mean when the Argosy lands there in 2060 and the Giants rebuild their civilization on Earth, Circle City will become a Neo-Atlantis.
Oh, right. Yikes.
The 6 of us exited the skyway and spiraled down another weird ramp thing to the bottom of the tower. We stepped out onto a foggy street, but there became riveted. All of us froze. Almost all of us. Clyde alone was unaffected. The aquatic had gone a few steps before noticing that we were not with him. He turned back. Through his water-filled helmet, he looked us over, confused. Clyde couldn't understand what was happening to his companions, which was ironic because all of us dry land people were, for the very first time, experiencing the world as he did, soundlessly. This island might as well have shared in the literal fate of its forebear, Atlantis, for it was very much like it had sunk into the inaudible depths of the ocean. It was so quiet. There was psychological silence, too. Fully conscious as we were that this place was abandoned, there was still that part of our brains confused by the total absence of bustling that every city should have, even one on an alien planet. But it was more than just that. The buildings, as enormous and tightly clustered as they were, refused the sound of the ocean, what had become background noise that none of us noticed until it was gone. But it was more than even this, listener. In an empty metropolis, you would expect the wildlife to move back in, reclaiming what was stolen from them. But there were no animals. Like the other islands, nothing lived here. There were no chirping birds, no chittering vermin, nothing. Joseph told me later that this phenomenon was recorded in the books. Natural creatures apparently sense the unnaturalness of the Nephilim and flee their presence. Even with the giants long gone, the wildlife had not returned. It was as if the creatures shared the belief of the Ariels that these islands were no longer a part of their world, cursed and cut off forever. Longing for a sound of any kind, we started off, comforted by our own footsteps. As our group moved down the street, I looked to my left and my right, trying to glean what I could from the architecture. It was as alien as the language of this place. The city had been magnificent at one time. It was hard to imagine that grandeur now as I looked upon the corroding metallic walls of the buildings. Or building, I soon realized. Unlike a traditional city, this metropolis was not made up of a series of structures, but rather segments of one megastructure. And this is also why the roadway we traveled never reached an intersection of any kind. There were no cross streets because there was only one street. This made for simplified travel, removing any possibility of getting lost. But I didn't understand the functionality of this system until we came to the first curve in the roadway. My assumption is that the metropolis had been designed circularly and that the street coiled through the entire megastructure, starting wide at the edges and ever tightening as it reached the center. For as unique as the Lost Isles were in their constructions, I remembered that the Strangers also favored curves over angles. Maybe those Ariels who had betrayed their kind and gone with the earthly invaders into exile had influenced the design of this place. Maybe the Giants had simply stolen the style. Who could say? Whatever the reason, circles and not squares had become the dominant architectural shape of this world. Yesterday, Joseph had told me of the Atlanteans, of how they were denied their own names and faces, of how they were conditioned to be mindless drones. I wondered then if the design of this island city, of them all, was in some way connected to the Nephilim's mastery over their human subjects. I mean, the very street spiraled hypnotically. Was this to keep them mesmerized? Obviously not, but less cartoonishly, the design of the street might have worked to this end. It was purposefully inefficient, requiring more time and energy to travel. I had learned that cults use this tactic, keeping their members overworked and tired, making them easier to control. I would soon witness just how strong the hold was that the Nephilim had over the Atlanteans. We walked for almost 2 hours, the bend of the street sharpening gradually just enough to make us feel like we were going in a circle. We had crested about a quarter of the island now, or so May called over her shoulder when I asked about our progress. The group needed a rest, but we needed to be free of this place more, so we pushed on without complaint. But soon enough, the 6 of us were forced to a stop. A wrecked airship lay blocking our path. From where it had cratered in the street, I looked up, retracing its crash landing. The walls of the megastructure were scorched and dented on either side from where the craft had ricocheted between them on its way down. The fog put a stop to my climbing eyes, but it couldn't prevent me from imagining the roof of the megastructure, where lay other wrecked dirigibles, no doubt. This was not one of the war machines whose vestiges we had seen earlier in our journey, then again more recently. This airship had a smaller, simpler design, with a cargo hold in the back. Clearly this vessel, and others like it, had been used by the Atlanteans for the transporting of wares about the archipelago. With just a couple of stiff wing flaps, Flo and Remy bound over the dirigible. The rest of us had to wade through the debris. I set a hand on a charred mass that crumpled under my palm. I wiped my hand without looking back, trying to convince myself that had not been the pilot's skull I just accidentally collapsed. When Gentry and the Ariels came here to give the war a definitive end, the Atlanteans had used these transport vehicles as the last line of air defense. Clearly the airships had made no difference, and as we know, the Lost Isles fell. But as we also know, Gentry and the Ariels had banished all those they captured. They had not executed any of their prisoners. So when we came upon a collection of skeletons farther down the roadway, we knew it was a mass suicide. What was I saying about cults a moment ago? The bones lay eerily undisturbed. The wind and probably much of the ocean's slanted rainfall were withheld by the walls of the megastructure. And as mentioned, there were no animals here to scavenge the bodies, so it was only slow, gentle decay that made a meal of these people. The skeletons were in 3 concentric circles. It wasn't until we saw the daggers laying among the bones that we understood the ritualistic process they had undertaken. Those Atlanteans in the innermost circle had had their throats cut from behind by those in the middle circle. Then the middle circle of Atlanteans had had their throats cut by those in the outermost circle. To finish the gruesome affair, some appointed dignitary had gone about the last, widest circle, doing away with each member of it one at a time. That person had probably then turned the dagger on him or herself. Joseph had told me that these people adhered to a strict hierarchy, so I assumed those in the innermost circle were of greater importance. They had the honor of dying first and all at once. The middle circle were treated to the same glory, but had to go second. The last circle, well, they must have been pretty low on the totem pole. I gaped at the sight. This was a hideous discovery, and it was made all the more hideous by the next one. The Atlanteans had not chosen this part of the street at random. They had ended themselves before an enormous statue. It was one of many. The megastructure had been designed with the occasional niche in its wall where loomed gigantic figures. I moved forward, stepping carefully through the field of bones and peering hard through the fog. Earthly sculptors have exaggerated the dimensions of their subjects for the entire history of the art form. That's not what we were seeing here. These were to scale. These were proper representations of the Nephilim. The one before us was no less than 10 feet in its height. The statue had been robbed of its details, however. It had been effaced, vandalized. They all had, by the Ariels who viewed them as idols. Looking back at the scattering of bones, imagining all of the bloodshed, I agreed with their sentiment. But why had they sacrificed themselves? Was it because of their failure? Or was it because they had been forsaken? When it was clear that they'd lost the war, the giants fled to their citadel and sealed themselves inside. Remember, without their masters, these people had nothing. May pulled me away from the niche. She goaded all of us onward. But even as I distanced myself from the scene physically, I could not escape it mentally. It was a haunting, a sickening display. This wasn't a city. It was a tomb, a necropolis. We were all the more desperate to be free of it now. Clyde seemed especially impatient, but for his own reasons. The aquatic brought us all to a stop as he signed to Remy.
What is he saying?
Here before, many times. Knows faster way to far shore.
A shortcut? Yes, please.
No, we continue this way.
He say through faster than around. Knows way.
We can cut through the buildings, like we did at the foundry, the mask-making place?
Yes.
We will keep our heading. This way will eventually come around.
Eventually? Why not just use the shortcut, May?
It is not safe.
If he's been through there before, then it should be safe enough, right?
We will keep to this road.
Please, Maevalesse, that place. Want to leave. Fast!
We are leaving. We just need to keep going. Come.
No.
No?
I want to vote for it.
We are staying on the road.
What are you afraid of, May? Do I need to ask for a show of hands, or is everyone already in agreement? Joseph, what do you think?
Joseph, please. The road.
Can you give us a good reason not to use the shortcut?
I cannot say.
Then I'm sorry, Maevalesse. If it's the faster way with no real dangers, we should use it.
Very well.
May relented and stepped aside as Clyde came forward. We now followed the aquatic. He led us farther up the street, studying the walls as he went. Then he found a nearly seamless panel that slid aside when merely touched. The door itself was its own button of activation. Clyde stepped into the darkness of the megastructure, his enormous eyes seeing clearly. There were no skylights in this building or windows of any kind, so the 6 of us formed a chain, a hand on the shoulder of the person in front of us. In this way, Clyde guided our group through the abyss. We stumbled along blindly, but soon got the hang of it. We emerged from this section and found ourselves in the street again, but a deeper portion of it. Clyde went forward to the wall facing us and was quick to find another panel. In we went, linking up again as we made our way through more darkness. We made good time doing this, cutting straight across the middle of the city. Our group was well on its way to the far side of the island. A couple more hours of this and we were already at the center of it, the inner core where the street ended, where the spiral came to a point. An exclamation point. There before us was a vast edifice that had the distinction of standing apart from the megastructure. The elliptical walls of it soared into the cloak of fog. The place was hard and unadorned, brutalist I think it would have been called on Earth. It also differed from the rest of the alien architecture in that we could tell exactly what it was. An amphitheater, a coliseum. May tried to subtly take the lead again, saying that it was a short enough walk to round the titanic building. She clenched her teeth, then her fist, when Clyde signed to Remy that there was both a front and back entryway. This meant we could cut straight through the amphitheater as we had been the megastructure and save even more time. Clyde once more took his place and spearheaded our group toward the edifice. An enormous gate awaited us, its arch cresting at no less than 40 feet. It dwarfed us all as we stepped through, even my husband. In a realm of literal giants, his height was not so extreme a thing. As if to drive home this point, we were confronted by more Nephilim statues inside the amphitheater. The towering idols stood surrounding the sand-covered arena. They had been engraved wearing full suits of armor, their faces hidden behind the lowered visors of helmets. They bore weaponry of various sorts in one hand and pressed shields to their bodies with the other. The place was as much a pantheon as it was a coliseum, I guess. As much of a temple as it was a stadium. But it had a third function as well. Our group moved out into the arena and there commenced to turn in slow, continuous circles, trying to behold the edifice in full. We did so with fascination, with awe. The amphitheater was vast, overshadowing even the grandest of earthly sports centers. There was no roof. It was completely open, but even decades of exposure had not diminished the mighty place. It had been designed to withstand the elements. The grandstand followed the rounded walls of the place, row after row of endless benches stair-stepping up into what we would have called the nosebleeds. We couldn't even see the topmost seats because of the oppressive fog. The entire Atlantean population could have assembled here at once. I assumed they were permitted this one amusement by their overlords, but bread and circus was for pacifying those with free will, which the people of the Lost Isles did not possess. No, this place was for the Giants' entertainment only, and where they would stand in judgment of their subjects. For the Atlanteans, this is where they would face trial for wrongdoing. At this advanced stage of their mental and physical conditioning, I very much doubted whether there was any insubordination to be punished, but mistakes were unavoidable. Accidents happen. And so this is where those responsible were held to account, and before the eyes of their entire civilization, no less. The Nephilim would make their human underlings watch as they dealt with failures in the most brutal of ways. A stadium, a temple, and a courthouse. May told me all about these horrific tribunals at a later time, so my feelings then were still of wonder and not disgust. I really should have realized this on my own, however, as there were no designated places for the giants. The amphitheater had no special box seating, no thrones for its kings. This could only mean that the Nephilim spent their time in the arena, dispensing their draconian justice. And this, as it turns out, they did to more than just the Atlanteans. Similar to when I first stepped through the portal to this alien world, my attention had gone wide, then come back to my immediate surroundings. I looked to the arena floor. It was transparent, I saw, kicking aside some sand, or had been at one time. The floor was nearly opaque now, with scuffs and scratches and stains that could only be very old blood. I knelt and peered hard through what I assumed was the same miracle of metallurgy with which the Atlanteans had made their masks and the animal enclosures and many other things. Beneath us was an intricate network of platforms. Elevators, I realized. Pushing aside more sand, I found rectangular seams. There were panels in the floor, like those Clyde had been opening for us the whole way here. This was how the Nephilim gladiators would be brought up to the arena, giving themselves a dramatic entrance. May, hoping we'd satisfied our curiosity, insisted we keep moving and even started forward, but no one followed her. She stopped several paces away, keeping her back to us. Her wings opened, then clapped shut impatiently. We ignored her, captivated as we were by our surroundings. When the group did start moving again, it wasn't to leave, but to spread out across the arena, to explore it. My husband found something in the sand and picked it up. When he turned to me, I saw that he now cradled in both arms a gigantic sword, a gladius he called it when I came to join him.
Look at this. Can you imagine this thing being swung around?
I'd rather not.
You see the design of the hilt here? I think it's shock absorbing.
What?
You know how if you, swing a baseball bat against a tree, the impact can actually hurt you? That wouldn't happen with this sword.
Charming. Please put it down, babe. So, what? They would fight here? I had trouble believing that the Nephilim would engage in gladiatorial combat. Joseph had at least a partial answer for me. In his manuscript, Gentry recorded what he'd gleaned of their culture. For as highly advanced as they had become, the unholy hybrids had maintained a hold on their original warriorism. They were made to prove themselves, to demonstrate publicly their physical prowess. But then May chimed in. She kept her back to us as she spoke, and as she did, we learned the additional purposes of this amphitheater that I have only so far hinted upon.
The giants would only spar. It was never to the death. That was for us to do.
May's words were accompanied by something we'd never heard in them before: emotion. We all exchanged looks among ourselves, equally surprised and concerned. Worst of all the horrors we'd so far witnessed was the wavering in our leader's voice. Slowly, unsettled, we moved to join her. We thought she'd turned her back on us in anger, which was probably true, but she'd kept it turned as her eyes had fixed upon something in the sand. We now shared her view of it. Before us lay a skeleton. Not our first of the day, but this one was different. There were extra bones that I did not immediately recognize as having once belonged to wings.
My kind lived with the giants in their citadel, in the outer shell of it anyway, where we had living chambers with balconies and... We were never permitted to enter the inner structure, where they were toiling away on their secret escape plan, an escape plan that did not include any of their underlings. Still, they kept the amalgams close, favoring us over their other subjects. Favored us because we, too, were a hybrid race like their own. The giants cannot reproduce themselves, so we were the only children they had ever known. But they did not love us as parents, nor teach us as such. We were instead trained, hardened. Sentimentality was a weakness. It will come as no surprise to any of you that I was their best student. Even still, I was not like them. None of us were. The amalgams are not unholy abominations. So even as they sought to take our souls, some of us held on to them, even shared them with others. Friendships were forbidden, and when discovered, the giants would pit the two offenders against one another in a battle to the death, thereby resolving the problem.
Is that what happened here, May?
I happened here.
What? You? You did this? Who was this?
She had no name. None of us did. Maevalesse is an aerial name, given to me when taken from this place. But here she and I were nameless. I only knew her as my dearest friend, a sister, and they made me kill her. We were only children.
May dropped her spear into the sand, then wept bitterly into her now empty hands. The amalgam sank to her knees before the skeleton and bowed forlornly, as if begging for forgiveness. The outpouring shocked our group. Everyone shrank back from May. I alone then took a step toward her, extending an uneasy hand. Before I could lay it upon her shoulder, though, the amalgam erupted. With a visceral scream, she sprang up. The amalgam marched over to that enormous gladius and took it up. May dragged the heavy thing behind her as she continued across the arena to the nearest of those towering statues. Then, with all of her bodily strength, she lifted and swung the sword in both hands. The blade connected and chipped a chunk of stone from the ankle of the idol. May wound back, lifted and swung the gladius again, cleaving a larger wedge from the colossus. She was chopping it down like a tree. All we could do was watch in disbelief as she worked. 3 more powerful strokes, and the giant began to teeter. The next and final blow brought the statue down to the arena floor, where it fractured at several points. Panting, exhausted, May wasn't done yet. She lugged the massive sword to the head of the statue. Hoisting the weapon up, she brought it down on the neck, smashing more than severing the head from its body. Then, and only then, did she drop the gladius, then herself, into the sand. I moved forward to go to her, but Flo stopped me. The Ariel shook her head. She knew May better than I. The amalgam needed to be alone.
We should not have come here. We should not have forced her.
How were we to know? If she had only told us...
She did tell us, as much as she could, but we didn't listen. I didn't listen.
Joseph hung his head and shook it, putting the majority of the guilt on himself. He had been the deciding vote to come this way. He confessed to me later that he had wanted to take the shortcut, not because it meant getting off the island sooner, but because it meant seeing more of it. Remember, this was a wonderland to him. These were places that he'd only ever read about. His curiosity had distracted him from the obvious subtext in our friend's words. He blamed himself for not picking up on it, even though none of us had. Because her pleas had fallen on deaf ears, we had made the amalgam relive unimaginable trauma from her youth. We had failed a friend who had never failed us. Our group waited patiently, meekly, for May to collect herself and return to us. When she did, no words were spoken. She simply gestured for Clyde to lead on. The aquatic moved swifter than he had before, guiding us with more intense motivation. Watching May bring down the giant probably had something to do with it. Traversing what remained of the megastructure, we then, at last, came to the far side of the island. The next link in the chain was the centermost of them all, where the citadel had once stood and where we would find our enemy. Our quest was nearing its end. There was just one problem. The bridge connecting this island to the next had been utterly destroyed, and not by age or weather or war. There was purple scorching all around the severed viaduct, the same left in the slain dragon. The witch had cut us off. I don't see another skywalk, so now what?
We can use the Leviathan. We can simply ride across.
Our enemy will surely see such a large creature coming ashore, and kill it as she did the wyvern. We must leave the Leviathan behind as we did the manticores.
So that we have a way home.
Yes.
But how are we supposed to get across the water?
I've got it. The Imperial Hotel.
What? Oh, no. No.
It worked last time.
May, understanding my husband's meaning now as well, scanned the shoreline, her eyes going only as far as the fog would allow, but it was far enough. She'd remembered a particular feature of this coastline and soon spotted it. There was a massive crag jutting out over the sea, doing so at a considerable height. We could climb this outcropping and, from the cliff of it, soar over to the next island. We had done something similar before on Earth when trying to get into the old iron foundry quickly and quietly. We had scaled the scaffolding and framework of the unfinished Imperial Hotel, taking flight from its 7th floor. Like my husband said, it had worked then, why not a second time? Flo and Remy would carry Clyde over, then come back for Joseph. May, as before, would glide me across. The flight between this shore and the next was far shorter, far clearer than the one we could not attempt earlier between the mainland and the archipelago. Even still, I would have tried to veto the idea, but knew it was our only option. I resigned myself to the terrifying escapade once more. Remy signed our idea to Clyde, who agreed to it, but only after an initial hesitation. Then our group started off toward the crag. Coming to it, the Ariels offered to hoist us flightless ones to the top, but we wanted them to save their strength for the more important delivery they were to soon make. so as Flo and Remy fluttered to the peak, the rest of us began the slow climb. The grade was not terribly steep, but the face of the rock was sheer, making firm handholds difficult to come by. Having been in the stillness of the megastructure for so long, I had forgotten the tumult of the sea and the wind. The latter seemed worse now than before, but I figured it was our increasing elevation. For as unwelcoming as it was, the cold, rushing air did not turn hostile until we surmounted the bluff, where it tried to knock us over the edge. We braced ourselves as best we could. The aerials, who had come here ahead of us, were crouched low, the wind catching their wings like sails, threatening to carry them over the side. It was a perilous spot, this cliff top, so we got right to the business that had brought us here. Just as we'd planned, Flo and Remy took hold of Clyde. With an aerial gripping either arm, the aquatic looked concerned. The expressions of the oceanic people are as difficult to read as their sign language, especially through their tinted water-filled helmets. So the fact that I could tell Clyde was nervous meant that he was very nervous. He was a man of the sea, not the dry land, let alone the air. The vault of the sky was as unknown and frightening to him as the depths of the sea were to us. But he was as brave a warrior as they come. So he motioned to Remy that he was ready. The aerials looked past their aquatic cargo to one another, counting down. Then they threw up in their wings simultaneously. The wind swept them over the brink with disturbing swiftness. They fell, but then swooped sharply up, soaring across the water to the neighboring island. Through breaks in the fog, we watched their flight for as long as we could, but eventually they were hidden from us. We waited tensely, not knowing for sure if they had made it or not. Then lighted eyes began to show through the mist. They had delivered Clyde safely and were coming back for Joseph, who couldn't wait for his turn. My husband was smiling excitedly as if he'd been waiting to do this again ever since the last time. Joseph winked at me before he, too, went soaring across the water, vanishing into the fog. My heart leapt, but I didn't have time to fret.
Let us go.
Okay.
I will not drop you, Lindsay. I promise.
I know you won't, May. Here, let me have your spear. I can wedge it through my harness so neither of us have to carry it. Hey, listen, May. About earlier, we're really...
Think nothing of it.
She said this coldly. Colder than usual, I mean. After her outburst in the arena, May's stoicism had returned, but it was not the same as before. The amalgam seemed vulnerable, humiliated perhaps, that we'd seen her like that. Whatever the case, when she took hold of my wrists, I felt the strength of my friend. I gripped her back trustfully as we stepped to the edge of the bluff.
Oh, I really hate this part!
We pitched over the side, me dangling from May as if she was my hang glider. The amalgam threw out her wings and caught the wind. We went from a sharp plummet to a sharper upswing. I know we must have flown over the water and through the fog, but I didn't see any of it. Like the last time, I kept my eyes shut. That is, until I felt us making our descent. Then I peeked and saw the shore coming up beneath us. I readied myself for the landing. May would let go as soon as my feet were near enough to connect with the ground again, leaving me to dash forward a few steps while she alighted ahead of me. And that's exactly what happened. You'd think we'd done this before. The rest of our group came to meet us. Joseph and I took hands and kissed, happy to be reunited. We'd been separated only briefly, but for that short time there had been an enormous gulf between us. He and I had not been parted by such a distance since coming to this world. It was not a feeling that we liked. Now reassembled, our group put our backs to the sea and faced the island, but as ever, the fog kept its secrets. Had I opened my eyes while still in the heights of the sky, I would have caught glimpses of our destination through gaps in the mist, as May and the others had. They described an enormous ring of rubble. The debris was from the shell of the citadel, where the amalgams had once lived, but also functioned as a vertical hangar. This had been shed in a controlled demolition in order to reveal the twin spacecraft beneath. When this pair launched, the engines had apparently blown the bits aside, carving out a basin. It was like a crater, but one formed by bodies headed into space instead of bodies coming out of space. Well, one body. As we know, only a single twin reached the stars. The other was drowned in an ocean, somewhere on the far side of the planet. I was suddenly afraid to continue on. We'd come all this way, met and bested so many dangers, and yet I wanted nothing more than to turn back, to flee. The sensation was overwhelming and had come out of nowhere. Looking to my companions, I saw that they felt it too. How could we all be feeling the same thing, if not from an external source? But then, piercing this awful dread, came the mountaintop presence. We were so far from it, and yet not. I felt it. We all did, and so we pressed on. Our group came to the rubble heap and began scaling it. We moved carefully up the irregular wall of shards and chunks. Wordless, we surmounted the ring and peered over the top, down into the crater, what was another arena. The Nephilim had built a coliseum when they came here. Then, with their departure, inadvertently created a second. And there, at the center of it, and the center of the entire island chain, in the dark heart of the Lost Isles, awaited us the witch. Do good, fight evil, repeat. I'm Lindsay Leck, and this is the Endless Elsewhere podcast.